far back in time, long before cities, long before written words, long before even the idea of history itself. The earth was a silent and unfamiliar place. Mountains stood older than memory. Rivers carved paths through lands untouched by human hands. Great forests stretched across continents like endless green oceans. And somewhere inside this vast and wild world, the first humans began their journey. But they did not appear suddenly. There was no single moment when the world changed overnight. Instead, it was slow. So slow that if you could watch it from above, it would look like a gentle shift over millions of years. Life experimenting with itself, nature trying new forms, new shapes, new ways to survive. In the beginning, there were creatures that were not yet human, but not fully something else either. They walked on two legs sometimes, but still climbed trees like animals. They used their hands, but not like we do today. Their minds were growing, little by little, like a flame slowly learning how to burn brighter. Africa was the birthplace of this long story, not the Africa we know today with cities and roads, but a raw, ancient world filled with open grasslands, deep forests, and dangerous predators. Here, survival was not guaranteed. Every day was a test. Every sound in the grass could mean life or death. In this world lived early human ancestors. They were small, fragile by modern standards, and yet something about them was changing. They were learning to stand taller, to see farther, to free their hands from walking so they could begin using tools. At first, these tools were nothing more than sharp stones, simple, rough, but powerful in a world where even a small advantage meant survival. Imagine one of them standing near a riverbank. The sun is low in the sky, painting the water gold. In their hand is a stone, broken in a way that creates a sharp edge. They do not understand science or invention, but they understand need. With that stone, they cut meat, break bones, survive another day. It is not just a tool. It is the beginning of everything. And slowly, over thousands, and then hundreds of thousands of years, something begins to shift inside their minds. The brain grows larger, not just in size, but in ability. Memory becomes stronger. Awareness deepens. They start to recognize patterns in the world, seasons, animal behavior, danger, safety. They begin to communicate. At first, it is not language as we know it. It may have been gestures, sounds, simple calls, a warning, a signal, a way to say, I am here or danger is near. But even this small step changes everything, because once a thought can be shared, survival becomes a group effort. And once survival becomes shared, evolution speeds up in ways the Earth had never seen before. Groups begin to form, small bands of early humans moving together across the land. They travel not because they want to explore, but because they must follow food, water, and safety. Life is constant movement, constant uncertainty. They sleep under open skies, watching stars they do not understand, but feel deeply connected to. And the stars, they are always there, silent witnesses to every step of this unfolding story. In these early groups, something important begins to grow: connection. Not just survival-based cooperation, but something deeper: protection, care, maybe even the earliest form of emotion we would recognize as bonding. A mother holding her child close in the cold night. A group sharing food after a successful hunt. Small moments, but powerful enough to shape the future of humanity. Still, the world around them is harsh. Predators roam the land. Weather changes without warning. One season brings abundance, the next brings hunger. Many do not survive. Entire groups can disappear, leaving no trace except broken stones and faint marks in the soil. Yet humanity does not stop, because something inside them keeps pushing forward. Across generations, their tools become slightly better. Their movements become slightly smarter. Their awareness of the world grows deeper. Fire is not yet fully mastered, but there are moments where lightning-struck flames are observed, feared, and remembered. Fire becomes a mystery they will one day learn to control. But for now, it is something wild and dangerous. And deep inside their growing minds, another transformation is quietly taking place: the ability to imagine. At first, imagination is simple: a memory of food, a fear of a predator. But slowly, it becomes something more: the ability to think beyond the present moment, to remember the past and anticipate the future. This is where the first humans begin to separate from all other life on Earth. But this change comes with questions. Strange, unanswerable feelings begin to form. Why does the sun rise? Why does rain fall? Why do people die? They have no answers yet. But the questions themselves begin to shape the human mind in ways that will one day lead to belief, storytelling, and meaning. And somewhere in the vast African plains, one small group of early humans stands at the edge of a great unknown. They do not know it yet, but they are about to take steps that will change not just their own survival, but the entire future of life on Earth. They gather in the early morning light. The air is still. The grass moves gently with the wind. In the distance, something stirs, something new, something that has not been seen before in quite this way. The morning was still young when the group began to move. The sun had just started rising above the horizon, spreading soft golden light across the endless African plains. The grass shimmered like waves in a quiet ocean. Birds called from faraway trees, and a gentle wind passed through the land like a whisper that no one could fully understand. The early humans walked slowly, carefully. Every step they took was shaped by memory and instinct. They did not have maps. They did not have language as we know it. but they had something powerful growing inside them: awareness. They traveled in a small group, close enough to see each other at all times. Each member had a role, even if they did not think of it that way. The strongest stayed near the edges, watching for danger. The older ones guided direction through memory of land and food sources. The young stayed in the center, protected, learning, without even realizing they were learning. They were following something simple: survival. Food and water were not guaranteed. The land changed constantly. A place that was rich with fruit and animals one season could become empty and dry in another. So they moved, always moved, like the earth itself was teaching them that nothing stays forever. As they walked, they passed through tall grass that reached their waists. Somewhere in that grass, life was watching them too. A distant roar echoed across the land, low and deep, reminding them that they were not the strongest creatures here. Not yet. One of them stopped suddenly. The group froze. Silence spread quickly, heavier than sound. Even the wind seemed to pause for a moment. A shape moved in the grass ahead. Slow, heavy, unknown. The early humans did not understand exactly what they were seeing, but their bodies understood danger. Hearts beat faster. Muscles tightened. Breath became shallow. And then the shape revealed itself. It was a large animal, powerful, moving slowly across the land. It did not notice them. Or perhaps it simply did not care. In that moment, the humans understood something deeply without words. The world belonged to everything, not just them. They waited until it passed. Only then did they continue walking. This is how their world worked. A constant balance between fear and movement, between staying alive and stepping into danger. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, growing stronger. Heat pressed down on the land. The group began to feel thirst. Their journey was not just about direction anymore. It was about necessity. They needed water soon, or the journey would become dangerous in a different way. Then, something changed. One of the younger members made a sound. A sharp, excited call. Not words, but something meaningful. The group turned toward him. He had found something. A faint trail, damp soil, broken branches, signs that water was nearby. The group followed quickly, energy returning to their tired bodies. Hope is powerful, even in its earliest form. It pushes living beings forward when logic alone cannot. And then they saw it. A river, not wide and endless like oceans they would one day discover, but strong and alive. Water flowed through the land, carrying reflections of sky and sun. Animals gathered at its edges. Birds moved above it. Life surrounded it. For the early humans, this was not just water. This was survival. They approached carefully, watching for danger. Rivers were not always safe. Predators often waited nearby. But hunger and thirst were stronger than fear. One by one, They stepped closer. The first touch of water was a moment that none of them could have understood fully, but felt deeply. Cool, alive, refreshing. It was like the land itself was offering them a gift. They drank, and for a moment, everything was still. No fear, no movement, just the simple truth of survival being fulfilled. But the world never stays peaceful for long. From the far side of the river, movement appeared again. This time faster, more urgent. A group of animals had come to drink as well. But among them, something else moved. Something alert. Something dangerous. A predator. The early humans noticed too late. The calm of the riverbank shattered instantly. Panic spread through the group like fire. They had been focused on water, on relief, and now reality returned with force. They moved quickly away from the water's edge, pulling children close, grabbing whatever tools they had. Their sharp stones, their sticks, small defenses in a world of giants. The predator stepped closer, watching, calculating. It was not rushing. It did not need to. It understood power. The humans stood frozen, unsure whether to run or stay. Running could trigger chase. Staying could mean death. This moment stretched longer than time itself, each second heavier than the last. And then something unexpected happened. One of the older members stepped forward slightly. Not far, just enough to show presence. He held a stone in his hand, raised it. It was not strength that mattered. It was something else. A shared understanding between survival and risk. A message without words. We are not easy prey. The predator watched. The river flowed behind them. The world held its breath. And then, slowly, the animal turned away. It chose easier prey somewhere else, disappearing into the grass like it had never been there at all. The group did not move for a long time. Even after danger was gone, their bodies refused to believe it immediately. Fear leaves slowly when survival is uncertain. But something had changed inside them in that moment. They had stood their ground, not perfectly, not powerfully, but together, and together mattered. As the sun began to lower in the sky, the group stayed near the river. They would rest here, at least for now. They had found water. They had survived another encounter with the unknown, but beyond the river, beyond the grasslands, beyond everything they could see. The world was still vast and filled with unanswered dangers. The sun had almost disappeared behind the distant horizon, leaving behind a deep orange glow that slowly faded into purple and then into darkness. The river that had once shimmered with bright life now reflected only the last traces of light, like a memory slowly sinking into night. The early humans stayed close together. They did not have shelters, no walls, no protection from the world except what they could create with their bodies and their fear. As darkness spread, their senses became sharper. Every sound mattered. Every movement in the grass felt closer than it really was. The river still flowed beside them, but now it sounded different. In the night, even water can feel like something unknown. They had survived the day, but survival does not end when the sun sets. In many ways, night was when survival became harder. One by one, the group settled onto the ground. Not comfortably, but strategically. They stayed close to each other, forming a rough circle. The young stayed in the middle again. The older ones stayed at the edges, eyes open, even when bodies wanted rest. This was instinct, not taught, not planned, just learned through countless generations of loss. Above them, the sky began to change. Stars appeared. At first, just a few, then more, until the entire sky became filled with tiny points of light. The early humans did not understand what they were seeing. To them, the sky was not a distant space filled with burning stars. It was simply there, a ceiling, a presence, something alive in its own silent way. Some of them stared upward for long moments, not out of curiosity alone, but out of something deeper, a feeling, a sense of something vast and unexplainable. But night was not for thinking. Night was for listening, and the world was never truly silent. From the grass came small movements, insects calling, distant animal sounds echoing across the plains. A sudden rustle made one of them sit up quickly. Everyone froze again. A moment passed. Nothing came. Still, fear lingered. They had learned that danger does not always arrive immediately. Sometimes it watches first. Hours slowly passed. The fire of daylight was gone, replaced by cold air and darkness that felt endless. The group stayed awake in turns, without ever agreeing to it. There was no system, no rule, but somehow they shared the burden of staying alert. And in that fragile balance between sleep and fear, something new began to happen inside the human mind. Dreams. At first, they were not understood. The sleeping mind created images, strange visions of running, falling, hunting, escaping. Faces of other group members appeared in distorted ways. Animals blended with landscapes. Fear and memory mixed together into something unreal. When they woke, they could not explain it, but they remembered it. This was one of the earliest steps toward imagination becoming separate from reality. Night continued, and then something changed in the distance. A sound, low, deep, slowly growing louder. The group instantly became alert. Bodies tensed. Eyes scanned the darkness, but darkness gave no answers. Only shapes, only uncertainty. The sound came again, closer. It was not just one sound now. It was movement, multiple movements. Something large traveling through the grass nearby. The humans gathered tighter together. Their breathing became controlled, almost silent. The instinct to stay still was stronger than the instinct to run. And then they saw it. Shadows moving just beyond the faint edge of river light. large forms passing through the grass, not attacking, not stopping, just moving. A herd of animals crossing the land at night. But to the humans, it did not matter what they were, only that they were powerful, larger than them, unpredictable. The group waited until the sound faded completely into the darkness. Only then did tension slowly release. But sleep did not return easily, because once fear enters the mind, it does not leave quickly. As the night deepened, one of the younger members began to make small sounds. Restless, uncomfortable. The older female beside him pulled him closer, holding him tightly. Not just for warmth, but for reassurance. This small act carried something important. Protection was no longer just physical. It was emotional. Even in these early moments of humanity, care began to take shape. Not as a concept, but as action. Holding someone, staying close, sharing safety. Time passed slowly. The sky rotated above them, stars shifting without sound. The river continued its endless flow, and the group slowly began to understand something without ever speaking it. Night always ends, and eventually faint changes appeared in the horizon. A thin line of light, the beginning of dawn. At first, it was almost unnoticeable, but slowly, the darkness began to lose its strength. Shapes became clearer. Sounds became less threatening. The world, once hidden, began to reveal itself again. The humans watched the change carefully. They had survived the night. Again, this was not new for them. But every survival felt like a small victory against a world that constantly tried to erase them. As light returned, the group slowly rose. Their bodies were tired, but movement was necessary. They could not stay in one place forever. Survival demanded continuation. But before they left, something unusual happened. One of them picked up a stone from the riverbank. Not the sharp tool from before, just a simple stone. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he carried it with him. It was a small action, almost meaningless. But it was the beginning of something deeper, because humans were no longer only reacting to the world. They were beginning to keep pieces of it. And as they turned away from the river and began walking once again into the unknown lands ahead, they carried more than just survival with them. They carried memory. The night had passed, but its weight still lingered in the air. Even as the first light of dawn touched the river, the early humans did not move quickly. They watched the world change slowly, carefully, as if they did not fully trust that daylight would truly return. The darkness had been long, filled with unknown sounds and hidden movements. And even now, their instincts were still listening for danger that no longer seemed visible. The river flowed as it always had, calm and steady, as if nothing had happened during the night. But for them, everything had changed inside. When they finally stood, their bodies were tired, but the need to move was stronger than rest. Survival never allowed comfort for too long. The group gathered their scattered attention, checking each other without words. Everyone was still there. Everyone had made it through the night. That itself was a victory. They began to walk again along the riverbank. The ground was softer here, shaped by water and time. Small footprints of animals marked the soil, reminding them that they were not alone in this land. Every step they took was a negotiation with the world, careful, alert, always aware that safety was temporary. As they moved, the young ones stayed close to the center again. The older members guided them, not with language, but with direction of movement and silent signals. A tilt of the head, a pause, a shift in pace. This was their communication, simple but effective. The morning light grew stronger. Warmth returned slowly to their bodies, and with warmth came a small easing of fear. Not complete relief, but enough to allow curiosity to rise again. One of them noticed something unusual near the river's edge. A shape partially buried in the soil. The group slowed. Caution returned immediately. They approached carefully, one step at a time, until the object became clear. It was a large bone, not fresh, not dangerous, but strange. It belonged to an animal far larger than anything they could challenge. Its size alone carried meaning they did not fully understand, but instinct told them it was important. Something powerful had once lived here. They gathered around it quietly. Some touched it, some simply stared. In their minds, there were no words like extinct or prehistoric. There was only presence and absence, life and what remains after life. One of them lifted a smaller fragment of the bone. It felt heavy, solid, unlike wood or stone. It was different, stronger in a way they could feel but not explain. And something began to happen inside their thinking. Not language yet, not knowledge, but awareness of possibility. If something this large once existed, then the world held more than what they currently understood. The bone was not food. It was not shelter. It was not an immediate survival tool, but they still carried it. This was a quiet but powerful shift. Humans were beginning to keep things for reasons beyond immediate need. They continued their journey. The bone now carried between them as they moved. It slowed them slightly, but no one abandoned it. It had become a silent object of importance. The landscape around them began to change as they moved farther from the river. The grasslands opened into wider plains. Trees became scattered instead of grouped. The air felt different, drier, more exposed. And with openness came vulnerability. Predators could be anywhere. The group moved more tightly now, instinctively forming a protective shape. Even without understanding strategy, their bodies learned patterns that increased survival. This was evolution, not just of form, but of behavior. Hours passed. The sun rose higher. Heat began to press down again, reminding them that comfort in this world was never permanent. They searched for water, for shade, for anything familiar. And then they heard something, a distant call, not human, not close, but familiar in its meaning, life nearby. They followed cautiously. The sound led them toward a patch of trees near a shallow valley. As they approached, they slowed again. The trees offered shade, but also hidden danger. The group hesitated at the edge, unsure whether to enter. Then, one of the older members stepped forward slightly. He did not lead with confidence. He led with necessity. The group followed. Inside the trees, the world felt different, cooler, quieter. The ground was softer, covered in leaves and broken branches. Light filtered through the canopy in scattered patterns. And there, in the distance, movement appeared again. Animals, smaller this time, not threatening immediately, but still wild, still unpredictable. The humans watched from a distance, observing rather than reacting. Something important was happening in them now. They were no longer only surviving encounters. They were beginning to study them. This was the earliest form of learning, through observation. A sudden movement from one of the animals made the group tense, but it did not approach. It simply moved away, continuing its path through the forest. The tension slowly faded, but curiosity remained. One of the younger humans stepped slightly forward, watching the space where the animals had disappeared. There was no fear in his movement now, only interest, a desire to understand. And that desire was new, not fully formed, but growing. The group did not stay long in the forest. They still did not trust it. But as they left, they carried something invisible with them, a memory of watching without fighting, of seeing without fleeing. And as they returned toward open land once more, the world ahead felt both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, because something inside them was changing quietly, slowly. And without their knowledge, the first humans were beginning to step beyond pure survival toward awareness of the world itself. The group moved through the open plains with the sun high above them, its light sharp and unrelenting. The warmth that had once felt comforting in the morning was now turning into pressure. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, with no clear path, no clear destination, only movement driven by need. They were still carrying the large bone they had found near the river. It was heavy, inconvenient, slow, but no one let go of it. This simple decision, unspoken and unexplained, showed something important happening inside their minds. They were beginning to assign meaning to objects beyond survival. The bone was no longer just remains of an animal. It was something they had chosen to keep, and choices like this were slowly shaping what they would become. As they walked, the heat grew stronger. The ground beneath them cracked in places where water had long disappeared. Dry grass rustled with the wind, but there was no promise of water ahead. Every step forward was a question they could not answer. How far? How long? Where next? But there were no answers in this world, only movement. Hours passed under the burning sky. The group's pace slowed slightly. Fatigue spread through their bodies. Even the strongest among them showed signs of exhaustion. Their survival depended not only on strength, but on endurance, the ability to continue when everything inside wanted to stop. Then one of them paused, a signal without words. The group immediately stopped. Instinct again. Ahead, something was different. The grass did not move naturally in the wind. There was a pattern to it, a subtle disruption. The group watched carefully, tension rising slowly. Then it appeared, a herd of animals, large, powerful, grazing peacefully across the plains. They were not predators, but they were not harmless either. Their size alone made them dangerous if approached carelessly. The early humans observed from a distance, staying low, staying still. They did not yet understand hunting in a structured way, not as a planned action, not as strategy, but they understood opportunity when they saw it. One of the animals moved slightly away from the group, a weak point, an opening. The humans tensed, not in coordination, not in agreement, but in shared instinct. For a brief moment, the idea of action formed inside them. A possibility, a risk, a reward, but hesitation followed immediately. They were not ready. The animal was too large, the group too uncertain, the tools too simple. And so they stayed still. They watched as the herd slowly moved across the plains, disappearing into the distance like a living wave. And just like that, the moment passed, but it did not disappear from memory. Something important had happened, not in action, but in thought. They had recognized opportunity. They had felt the pull of decision-making beyond immediate survival. And even though they did not act, the experience stayed with them. This was how learning began, not through success, but through awareness of what could have been. The group continued their journey. As the sun began to descend, the land slowly shifted again. The plains became slightly uneven, with more scattered trees and rocky ground. The air cooled a little, offering relief after the long heat of the day. And then they found something unexpected, a shallow depression in the earth where water had once gathered. It was not a flowing river, not a large lake, but it held something precious, moist ground, small pools of remaining water trapped between stones and soil. The group rushed forward with urgency now, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. They knelt, drinking, touching the wet earth, gathering what little water remained. This moment was quiet, but powerful. Water meant survival, and survival meant continuation. As they rested near the shallow pools, the bone they had carried was placed on the ground beside them. For the first time, no one was holding it, and yet no one abandoned it. It remained there like a silent companion. As the light faded again, they stayed longer than usual. Not because they were safe, but because they were recovering. The world had given them a brief pause. But pauses in nature are never permanent. As night approached, the group became alert once more. They had learned this cycle now. Day brought movement. Night brought uncertainty. The sky darkened slowly. The wind changed direction. Distant sounds returned. The world once again became unfamiliar. They formed their circle again, tighter this time. But something was different tonight. They were no longer entirely the same beings that had left the river. They had seen the bone. They had watched animals without fleeing. They had felt the hesitation of choice. And these small moments were accumulating inside them, layer by layer, shaping something new beneath survival. As darkness deepened, one of them picked up a small stone from the ground. He turned it in his hand, looked at it, felt its shape, and for a moment longer than before, he did not just see it as an object. He saw it as something that could be used, not yet fully understood, but imagined. And imagination, once awakened, does not return to silence. The night settled over them once again, but inside their minds, something had begun to shift quietly. The night was deeper than before, as if the world itself had grown heavier. Around the shallow pools of water, the early humans stayed close together, forming a tight circle that barely allowed space between bodies. The ground beneath them was still damp, carrying the last memory of water, but the air above them was cold and restless. Every small sound in the distance felt closer than it really was. The wind moved through the grass like something alive. It carried whispers of the land, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, the shifting of unseen creatures moving through the darkness. Even though nothing was clearly visible, everything was felt. They did not sleep deeply. Sleep had become something fragile, broken into short moments between awareness and fear. One eye closed, the other half open to the world. And yet, in this fragile state, something new continued forming inside them. Thoughts that were not directly tied to survival. One of them, sitting slightly apart from the group's center, kept turning a small stone in his hand. It was not sharp, not particularly useful, but he studied it anyway. The way it fit between his fingers, the way it felt when pressed against the ground, the sound it made when tapped against another rock. Tap, pause, tap again. To anyone watching from the outside, it meant nothing. But inside his mind, something was slowly assembling. A connection that did not yet have language. A possibility that objects could be used not just as they were found, but as they could become. This was not invention yet, but it was the beginning of it. Across the circle, the bone they had carried rested quietly on the ground. In the darkness, it looked even larger, even more unfamiliar. It did not belong to any of them, yet it had become part of their journey. No one questioned why they kept it. It simply stayed with them, like a silent reminder that the world had once been even more powerful than what they currently understood. Time moved slowly. The night stretched on. At one point, a sudden sound broke through the silence. Sharp, close. The group reacted instantly. Bodies tensed. Breathing stopped. Eyes searched the darkness, but darkness gave no answers. Only fear filled the space between them. The sound came again, this time clearer. Movement in the grass nearby. Something small but active. After a long moment of tension, a shape appeared briefly in the faint light. An animal passing near the edge of their resting place. Not a predator, not a threat, just something moving through its own path. But fear does not always distinguish. The group held still until the movement disappeared completely. Only then did they slowly relax again. But relaxation was never complete anymore. The memory of fear stayed longer each time. As the night continued, something else began to happen. The sky above them slowly shifted. The stars, countless and silent, remained fixed in their positions. But the humans watching them began to notice patterns. Not consciously at first, just repetition. Familiar shapes appearing night after night. One of them stared longer than usual. He noticed that certain lights seemed brighter than others. Some clustered together. Some moved slowly across the sky over long periods of time. He did not understand what he was seeing, but he remembered it. And memory, in early humans, was becoming more powerful than ever before. Eventually, exhaustion began to win. One by one, they drifted into sleep. But even sleep was no longer empty. Dreams came again, faster this time, stronger, a mixture of river water, animal shapes, falling stones, running through grass that never ended. The mind was no longer just reacting to reality. It was building its own version of it. And in those dreams, the stone in the young man's hand became something else. He saw himself strike it against another rock. He saw fragments break away. He saw edges become sharper. He woke suddenly, breathing fast. The idea was still there, unformed, but alive. Around him, the group remained asleep or half asleep, unaware of the shift happening inside one mind at a time. The night continued, but something had already changed. When dawn finally arrived, it did not bring immediate comfort. The air was still cold, the land still uncertain, but light returned, and with it, movement became necessary again. The group rose slowly, gathering themselves. The water pools were smaller now, slightly dried overnight. They drank what remained and prepared to continue. But before they left, the young man picked up 2 stones. Not randomly this time, deliberately. He held one in each hand. He looked at them, and then slowly he brought them together. A soft impact, then another. Nothing Nothing changed visibly, but inside his mind, something aligned. The group began to walk again, unaware of what had just occurred. They did not yet understand fire. They did not yet understand tools as we know them. They did not yet understand language fully, but they were now carrying something far more powerful than survival alone. They were carrying the beginning of transformation. As they moved across the open land once more, the horizon stretched endlessly ahead of them, hiding both danger and discovery in equal measure. The morning light spread across the land like a quiet revelation. After the cold night, everything seemed sharper, clearer, almost new. The grass shimmered with dew. The distant trees stood still against the pale sky. And the group of early humans moved forward once again, carrying with them exhaustion, memory, and something quietly changing inside their minds. They did not speak of what had happened in the night. They never did. But one of them still carried 2 stones. He did not show them. He did not announce anything. He simply held them from time to time, feeling their weight, remembering the sound they made when they touched. A soft impact that had stayed in his mind longer than it should have. The group moved slowly through uneven land. The terrain was changing again. The endless plains were starting to break into scattered hills and rocky patches. The air felt different here, less predictable, more uncertain. Every turn of the land could hide something new or something dangerous. They had learned by now that the world did not remain the same for long. Hours passed under the growing heat. The group stayed close together, conserving energy. They no longer wasted movement. Every step was part of survival logic they did not consciously understand, but instinctively followed. Then, as they crossed a rocky slope, something caught their attention. Smoke. At first, it was faint, almost invisible against the sky. A thin gray line rising from somewhere beyond the hills. The group stopped immediately. Stillness. Smoke meant something they had not yet fully understood. Sometimes it meant destruction. Sometimes it meant danger. They had seen trees struck by lightning before, burning uncontrollably, releasing strange light and heat that no creature dared approach. Fire was not something they controlled. Fire was something they feared. The group hesitated at the edge of the slope, watching the smoke rise slowly. It did not move like wind. It climbed upward as if being pulled by something unseen. Curiosity and fear fought inside them. One step forward, then stillness again. Eventually, they began to move toward it cautiously. The land beyond the slope opened into a shallow valley, and there, partially hidden among rocks and dry branches, they saw it. Fire. Not a large, raging storm like lightning fire, but something smaller, contained, alive. It burned within a rough circle of stones, flickering orange and red, moving constantly, yet staying in place. It consumed small pieces of wood, turning them into ash and smoke. The group froze completely. This was not like animals. This was not like water. This was something that should not exist without destruction. And yet it did. They watched from a distance, unable to move closer, unable to look away. The fire made sounds, soft crackling, shifting heat, occasional pops of burning wood. One of the younger members stepped back instinctively. But the young man who carried the stones did not move. He stared. Something inside him recognized the movement of the fire, the way it changed constantly, the way it transformed what it touched. It was destruction, yes, but also transformation. The group did not stay long. Fear eventually won over curiosity. They retreated to a safer distance, watching from afar as smoke continued to rise. They did not understand that they had just witnessed one of the most powerful forces in the world, something that would one day define human survival entirely. But for now, it remained a mystery. They continued their journey later that day, moving away from the valley. Yet, something had changed in their behavior. They were quieter than usual, more observant. Every crackle of dry grass reminded them of fire. Every smell of smoke carried through the wind made them pause. The memory of fire followed them. As evening approached, the group found shelter near a cluster of rocks. The land here was slightly safer, offering protection from wind and open sightlines. They settled carefully, still uneasy from what they had seen. That night, the sky was different again. Clouds gathered in the distance, dimming the stars. The air felt heavier. A storm was coming, and storms always brought lightning. They had seen lightning before. A sudden strike from the sky. A flash so bright it erased darkness for a moment. And always, after lightning fire, the group stayed alert as darkness settled in. The wind grew stronger. Grass bent and moved violently under unseen pressure. Distant thunder rolled across the sky like something awakening far away. Then came the rain. Heavy, sudden, cold. It hit the ground in waves, soaking everything quickly. The group huddled together under the rocks, trying to stay dry, but the storm did not care. And then a flash, bright enough to turn night into day for a moment. A loud crack followed immediately after. Lightning struck somewhere in the distance. The group froze. They waited, and then, faintly at first, they saw it. Beyond the hills, fire. Another one. This time uncontrolled, wild, spreading through dry grass and trees ignited by the storm. Flames moved with the wind, growing stronger, consuming everything in their path. The humans watched in silence. They were witnessing the same force again, but now multiplied, unleashed across the land. Fire was not just a mystery. It was power, danger, and something they could never ignore again. The storm continued through the night, but their attention remained fixed on the burning horizon, even as rain fell on them, even as thunder shook the sky. Their minds were locked on the distant flames. Inside one of them, the one who had been striking stones, something shifted again. He remembered the fire. He remembered the stones. He remembered the sound. And in that moment, a connection formed in his mind that had never existed before. Fire came from somewhere. Fire could be made. The thought was not clear, not complete, but it existed now. And once such a thought exists, it does not disappear. As the storm slowly began to fade, and the fire in the distance continued to burn, the early humans sat in silence, unaware that they had just stood at the edge of one of the greatest discoveries in all of human history. The storm had moved on, but its memory still lingered in the air. The ground was wet, heavy, and cold beneath the feet of the early humans as they slowly began to move again. The sky above them was still covered in fading clouds, breaking apart into soft patches of gray and pale blue. The distant sound of thunder had disappeared, but the silence that replaced it felt even deeper. They left the rocky shelter in small, cautious steps. No one spoke, not because they understood silence as we do today, but because something inside them still held onto what they had seen during the night. Fire in the distance, lightning from the sky, the sudden transformation of land into burning movement. It had not been forgotten. As they walked, the young man who carried the stones was different now. He did not look at the ground as often. His eyes moved more frequently toward the horizon, toward places where fire had once appeared. His thoughts were no longer just reactions to hunger or fear. Something else was forming, something that did not have a name. The group continued through uneven terrain, moving away from the valley where fire had been seen. The land here was rougher, more broken. Large stones scattered across the ground, small dry plants struggling to survive in the wet aftermath of rain. Every step required attention, but attention was no longer only about survival. It was becoming observation. Hours passed. The sun began to break through the clouds, creating shafts of light that fell across the land like silent columns. Everything looked washed and new, as if the storm had erased parts of the world and rewritten them. Then they stopped again, not because of danger this time, because of something unexpected. Ahead of them, in a small clearing between rocks, lay a charred patch of ground, blackened earth. Broken branches turned to ash, and faint wisps of smoke still rising. They had found it, the edge of the fire they had seen from a distance during the storm. Now they stood closer to its aftermath. The group hesitated at the edge of the burnt land. Some stepped back instinctively, remembering heat and danger. Others leaned forward slightly, trying to understand what they were seeing. The young man with the stones stepped closer than the rest. The ground was warm, not burning anymore, but still holding memory of fire. He knelt slowly, touched the ash. It crumbled between his fingers, He looked at it carefully, as if trying to understand what had changed the world so completely overnight. The trees here were no longer trees. The grass here was no longer grass. Everything had been transformed into something unrecognizable. Destruction, but also something else. The group spread out slightly, watching from a distance as he explored the burnt area. They were still afraid, but curiosity was slowly beginning to compete with fear. That balance was new and important. He found something among the ash, a partially burned branch, blackened on the outside, but still solid inside. He picked it up. It was light, different from stone, different from bone. He turned it in his hands, and then, without thinking too deeply, he struck it against a rock. Once, a small sound, nothing dramatic, but it echoed in his mind. He struck it again. The group watched, unsure what he was doing. Some stepped closer. Others stayed back. He continued experimenting. Different angles, different pressures. The burnt branch cracked slightly, revealing darker interior layers. He stopped, looked at it again, and for the first time, a connection formed more clearly than before. Fire changes things, and things that burn are not destroyed completely. They transform. The group eventually moved away from the burnt land, but they did not leave the memory behind. The sight of blackened earth followed them like a shadow. Every tree they passed seemed more fragile. Every dry leaf looked like something that could disappear instantly under flame. As they continued their journey, the land began to change again. Small hills rose more frequently. Valleys became deeper. The environment was no longer open plains or simple forest edges. It was becoming complex, layered, unpredictable. And unpredictability demanded adaptation. By late afternoon, they reached a wide river once again. Not the same river from earlier, but another flowing system cutting through the land. Water moved quickly here, carrying debris from storms upstream. They stopped to rest. Water meant safety. For a moment, tension eased, but not completely, because fire was still in their minds. As they sat near the riverbank, the young man placed the burnt stick beside him. He did not know why he kept it. It was not useful in any obvious way, but it felt important, like a piece of something larger he could not yet see. He picked up a stone, looked at it, then looked at the stick. Slowly, deliberately, he brought them closer together again. The group watched. He struck, a soft sound. Again, another sound. Nothing happened outwardly, but inside his mind, something was aligning more clearly now. Stone, impact, burned wood, fire, lightning, separate ideas, beginning to connect. The sun began to lower again, casting long reflections across the river. The group settled for the night near the water, unaware that their minds were no longer the same as when they had first gathered at the beginning of their journey. They were not just reacting anymore. They were starting to recognize patterns. And patterns, once seen, cannot be unseen. As darkness slowly approached once again, the young man kept the stone and the burnt stick close to him. The rest of the group drifted into uneasy rest, still carrying the memory of fire in the distance. But he stayed awake a little longer, watching, thinking, connecting things that had never been connected before. The night by the river was quieter than before, but not calmer, even though the water flowed steadily beside them, and the wind moved gently through the reeds. Something had changed in the way the group experienced darkness. It was no longer just fear of predators or unknown sounds in the grass. Now, there was something else lingering in their awareness. Fire. The memory of it did not fade with sleep. It stayed behind the eyes, in the pauses between breaths, in the moments when silence became too long. The group had formed their resting circle again, but it felt tighter now, almost defensive in a way that went beyond physical danger, as if they were protecting not just their bodies, but their thoughts. Most of them slept unevenly. Light sleep, interrupted sleep, sleep that could break at the smallest sound. But the young man with the stones and the burnt stick did not fully sleep at first. He sat near the edge of the group, the river faintly reflecting the night sky beside him. In his hands, he turned the stone again and again. The burnt stick lay beside him, partially buried in the soil so it would not roll away. He remembered the fire, not as fear now, but as something that had happened, something real, something that changed things. His mind kept returning to the moment he struck the stone against another stone. The sound, the small spark of understanding that had not yet fully formed, but refused to disappear. He struck the stones again, softer this time. Tap, pause, tap. Nothing visible happened, but his attention did not break. He repeated it again, adjusting slightly, experimenting without knowing that he was experimenting. And slowly, something subtle occurred. Not fire, not light, but pattern. He noticed that certain angles created sharper sounds. Certain forces created stronger impacts. The stones responded differently depending on how they were held. This was no longer random action. It was repetition with awareness. Across the group, someone shifted in their sleep. A small sound broke the silence. The young man paused immediately, listening. His body reacted before his mind fully did. Silence returned. No danger. He continued. Tap, pause, tap. Time passed in this strange balance between experimentation and awareness of the world around him. The river moved beside him, indifferent to his discovery. The stars above remained unchanged, as if watching without judgment. Eventually, exhaustion pulled him into a shallow sleep, but his mind did not stop. It continued working in fragments. Stone, impact, heat, fire, lightning, disconnected images drifting together in strange combinations. When morning arrived, light spread slowly across the river, turning the water into a soft ribbon of gold. The group began to wake one by one, stretching tired limbs, checking surroundings instinctively. But something else happened that morning. The young man did not immediately stand. Instead, he picked up both stones again, and without hesitation, he struck them together in full daylight. The sound was clearer now, sharper, more deliberate. A few members of the group turned to look, not in alarm, but in curiosity. They had seen him do this before, but now there was something different in the way he repeated it. More focused, less random, more intentional. He struck them again and again. The group slowly gathered closer, not understanding, but watching. One of them reached out and picked up a smaller stone from the ground. He imitated the movement clumsily, striking it against another rock. The result was weaker, uneven, but still similar. A faint imitation. Another member tried, then another, without instruction, without language, only observation and repetition. Soon, several small sounds filled the morning air, random, imperfect, but connected by a shared curiosity. This was no longer one mind experimenting alone. It was the beginning of shared learning. The young man watched them quietly. He did not teach them. He did not explain. He simply continued demonstrating through action, adjusting his movements slightly, observing their attempts. The group stayed near the river longer than usual that morning, not because they needed water, but because something new was happening. Attention itself had changed. Later, as they resumed their journey, the burnt stick was still carried along with them. It had become part of their collection of meaningful objects, even if no one could fully explain why. The land ahead grew more complex again. More hills, more scattered forests, more places where sight could not reach far ahead. This made movement more cautious, more deliberate, but also more exploratory. They were no longer moving only to escape or follow necessity. They were beginning to move with awareness of environment. As they crossed a shallow valley in the afternoon, they encountered something that made them stop again. A small cave entrance in the side of a rocky hill. Dark, still, unknown. The group hesitated at the entrance. Caves were not unfamiliar, but they were unpredictable. They could offer shelter or hide danger. The group stayed outside, watching. The young man stepped slightly closer. The darkness inside the cave felt different from night. Deeper, heavier, as if it held air that had not moved in a long time. He picked up a small stone, threw it inside. It bounced softly against rock. No response, only echo. The group listened, then waited. Nothing emerged. Slowly, cautiously, they began to understand something important. Not every unknown space is dangerous, but not every unknown space is safe either. This balance between fear and curiosity, was becoming more refined inside them. As the sun began to lower again, they did not enter the cave, but they remembered it, marked it mentally as something to return to. And as they continued their journey onward, the group moved with a slightly different energy now, more alert, more aware, and carrying, without realizing it, the early foundations of learning, imitation, and shared discovery. Behind them, the cave remained silent. Ahead of them, the land stretched endlessly. The sun rose slowly over the broken landscape, casting long shadows across hills, stones, and scattered patches of dry grass. The early humans moved forward once again, but their movement was no longer the same as before. Something subtle had changed in the way they traveled. They were more attentive now, more aware of details, more observant of everything around them. Even the silence between sounds felt meaningful. The cave they had left behind the previous day remained in their memory. No one spoke of it, but their glances occasionally drifted toward similar dark openings in the hills as they walked. It had become a reference point in their minds, a place that could be returned to, a place that existed beyond immediate survival. This was a quiet shift in thinking, not just movement, but mapping. The group continued through uneven terrain. The land was becoming more rugged now, filled with rocky outcrops and narrow passages between stone formations. It forced them to move differently, slower in some places, more carefully in others. Every step required evaluation. The young man still carried the stones. He also still carried the burnt stick. But now, something new had joined his awareness. The imitation of others. The memory of seeing group members strike stones after watching him. That realization had stayed with him longer than anything else. He would strike. They would follow, without words, without instruction, only observation. And in that pattern, something new had formed inside the group dynamic. Learning was no longer isolated. It was shared. As they moved through a narrow, rocky path, the group suddenly stopped again. Ahead, the land opened into a wider space filled with scattered stone formations. And in the center of it, something unusual stood out. A cluster of bones. Not one, many. Large, broken, weathered over time. Some partially buried in the soil. Others exposed, white against the darker ground. The remains of something massive. The group approached cautiously. Instinct still demanded caution when encountering signs of death. But curiosity now competed with fear. They spread out slowly around the area, examining the bones from a distance at first. The scale of them suggested something far larger than anything they encountered regularly. Larger even than the animals they had seen near the river. One of the bones had a curved shape, towering over them when partially lifted by two members of the group. Another lay half sunken into the earth, cracked and worn. The young man stepped closer than the rest. He placed his hand on one of the bones. Cold, solid, unmoving, unlike anything alive. He traced its surface slowly. In his mind, something began forming again, not fear, not awe alone, but a question that did not yet have language. What was this? And what had created it? The group stayed longer here than they had planned. Some circled the area. Others simply observed. No one touched everything, but everyone watched everything. Then one of them picked up a smaller fragment of bone. He tested its weight, then tapped it against another stone. The sound was different from stone on stone, deeper, more muted. Others noticed. Another member tried, then another. Soon, multiple small interactions began around the bone field. Stone against bone, bone against stone, each producing different sounds, different sensations. It was not structured. It was not understood. But it was exploration. The young man observed all of it quietly, and for the first time, he realized something without fully thinking it through. Different materials behave differently, and that difference can be explored. As the sun moved across the sky, the group eventually left the bone field behind. But like the cave, it remained in their memory. A place of learning without instruction. A place where objects revealed properties simply through interaction. By late afternoon, they reached a higher elevation. From here, the land stretched far into the distance. Vast, unpredictable, full of paths they had not yet taken. They stopped briefly to rest. From this height, they could see movement far away. Herds of animals crossing plains, distant shadows moving through valleys, clouds casting shifting patterns on the land below. The world felt larger here, and they felt smaller, but also more aware. The young man sat slightly apart, holding one stone in each hand again. But this time, he did not strike them immediately. He looked outward first, then down at the stones, then back at the land. Something inside him was connecting slowly. The world changes things, but things also change the world. That thought was not complete, not formed, but it existed. As evening approached, the group descended into a more sheltered valley for the night. They had learned now to seek places that offered natural protection, rock formations, uneven terrain, enclosed spaces. Survival was no longer random movement. It was increasingly shaped by experience. They settled in a semi-protected area between rocks. The night came slowly, and as darkness approached, something unusual happened again. The young man placed the stones together, but instead of striking them immediately, he held them still. He listened, not to sound, but to expectation. Then he struck once. A clean sound. He paused, then struck again. The group nearby noticed, but did not react strongly anymore. It had become part of their environment, this repeated action, this emerging behavior. But this time, something else was forming. Not imitation, not observation, but anticipation. anticipation. And anticipation is one of the earliest signs of thinking beyond the present moment. As night fully settled over them, the group rested once again under the scattered stars. The world remained dangerous, uncertain, and vast. But inside their minds, something far more powerful than fear was beginning to grow quietly. The night felt different this time, not because the world had changed outside them, but because something inside them had shifted quietly over the last many days. The early humans still gathered in their familiar circle near the sheltered valley between rocks. But their awareness no longer belonged only to fear and survival. It belonged to something wider, something deeper. Above them, the sky stretched endlessly, filled with scattered stars that seemed unchanged for eternity. The wind moved through the valley in slow waves, brushing against stone and dry grass. Somewhere in the distance, an animal called out, but this time, no one reacted instantly. Heads turned, yes. Bodies stayed alert, yes. But panic did not rise as quickly as before. There was a pause now between sound and fear, a small but powerful chain. The group settled into rest, but sleep did not arrive equally for everyone. Some drifted into it quickly from exhaustion. Others remained half awake, watching, listening, thinking in fragments. The young man with the stones sat slightly apart again. This had become his habit now. Not separation from the group, but a space for attention. He held the two stones loosely in his hands. The burnt stick rested beside him, darker now from repeated handling, but still intact. He did not strike the stones immediately tonight. Instead, he watched them in the faint starlight, turned them, examined them, felt their edges. In the past, these actions would have meant nothing, but now they were part of a growing pattern in his mind. Every interaction revealed something new: sound, weight, resistance, shape. He raised one stone slowly, paused, then struck it against the other. A soft, familiar sound. But this time, he did not stop there. He changed the angle, struck again. Different sound. He paused longer this time, and in that pause, something important happened. He began to expect change, not random movement, not instinct, but variation based on action. This was no longer simple imitation or curiosity. It was the early formation of controlled experimentation, though he did not have any concept of such words. Around him, the group remained mostly unaware of this internal shift. To them, it was still just repeated action with stones. Something interesting, perhaps, but not essential. Yet, evolution rarely announces itself. It grows quietly, unnoticed, until it becomes impossible to ignore. Hours passed slowly. The night remained calm, with no immediate threats appearing near the valley. Even the wind softened, as if the world itself had settled into temporary peace. But inside the young man's mind, the day's memories replayed again and again. The cave they had seen, the bones scattered across the land, the fire from the valley, the burnt earth. Each memory was no longer isolated. They were beginning to connect. Caves offered shelter. Bones meant something large once lived. Fire changed everything it touched. Stone created sound. Wood burned. Lightning created fire. The connections were incomplete, but they were forming a structure, like scattered pieces slowly aligning into a shape, not yet fully visible. He looked toward the burnt stick beside him, then toward the stone, then toward the dark horizon beyond the valley. And for the first time, a question formed in him that was not about immediate survival, but about cause. Where does fire come from? Not as a fear, not as observation, but as inquiry. This question did not have words in his mind. It existed only as feeling, a tension between unknown and understanding. As the night deepened, a faint sound came from somewhere outside the valley. The group stirred slightly, heads lifted, but the sound did not approach. It moved away. No danger followed, and once again, something new appeared in their behavior. They did not immediately return to fear. They waited, listened longer, then relaxed. This delay was becoming a pattern. Fear was still present, but no longer absolute. When dawn approached, the sky slowly brightened from deep black to deep blue, then to pale gray. The group began to wake, one by one, shaking off sleep and gathering themselves for movement. But before they left, something unusual happened again. The young man stood up slightly earlier than the others. He picked up 2 stones, looked at them, and this time, instead of striking immediately, he showed them to another member of the group. The other looked at him, then at the stones, then back at him. A moment passed. No instruction, no language, only shared attention. The young man struck the stones together once. The sound echoed softly in the morning air. The other watched closely, then picked up a stone from the ground and tried to imitate the motion. It was imperfect, uncontrolled, but similar. Another member noticed, then another. Soon, the small action spread again, not as teaching, but as repetition through observation. And in that moment, something fundamental was taking shape inside the group. Knowledge was no longer trapped inside a single mind. It was beginning to move between minds. As they prepared to continue their journey, the group gathered their small belongings, including the burnt stick and scattered stones that had become strangely important to them. The land ahead stretched vast and unknown once again. Hills rising in the distance, valleys cutting through the earth, paths that had never been walked before. But now, they were no longer moving only as survivors. They were moving as learners, observers, experimenters of a world they were only beginning to understand. The land ahead was no longer the simple world they once knew. It had become layered, complex, almost like a living maze of valleys, hills, and shifting paths that forced constant decisions. Every direction now carried meaning. Every turn of terrain could lead to water, shelter, danger, or discovery. The early humans moved through it not as wanderers anymore, but as cautious readers of the world. They no longer walked blindly. They observed. They paused more often. They looked before stepping, and they remembered. Memory had become one of their strongest tools, stronger even than their hands. The group traveled through a region filled with scattered rock formations that rose like silent giants from the earth. Between these formations, narrow passages twisted and turned, sometimes opening into wide spaces, sometimes closing into tight corridors that forced them to move one behind another. In such places, silence became more important than movement. The sound of footsteps echoed strangely here, bouncing between stone walls. Even the smallest noise felt amplified, as if the land itself was listening. The young man still carried the stones, but now he also carried attention from others. Not openly, not spoken, but felt. When he stopped, others sometimes stopped. When he observed, others sometimes followed his gaze. It was subtle, but real. Leadership was forming not through force, but through repeated recognition of patterns. As they moved deeper into the rocky region, they came across something unexpected again. A narrow opening between two large stone walls, dark, vertical, almost like the earth had been split open. The group stopped at its entrance. They had seen caves before, but this was different. Taller, deeper, less visible from the outside. A few members stepped back instinctively. Others leaned forward slightly, trying to see inside. The young man approached slowly. He picked up a small stone and dropped it inside. The sound echoed downward, farther than expected, longer than expected. The echo did not end quickly. It traveled, bounced, returned in faint fragments. The group listened carefully. This was not just emptiness. This was depth. The idea of inside the earth was still new to them. They understood shelter, but not vast enclosed spaces hidden beneath or within land. After a long hesitation, they did not enter, but they did something new. They marked it in memory, a place to return to, a place of unknown potential. Then they continued onward. By midday, the terrain began to soften again. Rocks became fewer. Grass returned in patches, and with it, signs of animal movement increased. They slowed, watched, tracked without knowing they were tracking. Then they found something that made them stop completely. A cluster of animals feeding near a shallow water patch. Not the large herds they had seen before. Smaller ones, more vulnerable, closer to their own size. The group crouched instinctively behind a rise in the land, observing quietly. Something was different this time. There was no immediate fear. no immediate retreat. Instead, there was evaluation, distance, size, movement, opportunity. The young man watched closely. He noticed how the animals lowered their heads to feed, how they moved slowly when distracted, how their attention shifted unpredictably. Then he looked at the stones in his hands, and something new formed in his thinking. Not attack, not yet, but possibility. If stones could strike, if wood could burn, if groups could imitate, then actions might influence outcomes beyond instinct. The idea was fragile, incomplete, but it existed. The group did not act on the animals. Instead, they slowly backed away, avoiding detection. This itself was important. They were no longer only reacting. They were choosing not to act, and choice is one of the earliest forms of strategy. As they moved away from the feeding ground, the sun began to lower again. The sky shifted into warmer tones, casting long shadows across the grassland. They found shelter near a cluster of low rocks and trees, preparing for another night. But something unusual was happening now in their behavior. There was less chaos, less panic, more structure in how they settled. They formed resting positions more deliberately. The center remained protected. The edges remained watchful. Even without formal leadership, roles were becoming consistent. The burnt stick and stones were placed together near the young man again. He sat slightly apart, and this time he did something different. He did not strike the stones immediately. He placed one on the ground, then placed the other beside it. He watched them, as if expecting something, as if waiting for something to reveal itself. Nothing happened, but his mind did not reject that silence. Instead, it began to explore it. What if action must be repeated? What if conditions matter? What if fire is not random? These thoughts were still incomplete, but they were no longer isolated. They were forming connections across memory. As night settled over the land once again, the group rested under a sky filled with endless stars. The world remained vast, dangerous, and unpredictable, but within them, something far more significant than survival was beginning to take shape. The ability to question. The night was calm, but it was no longer empty. Even in silence, the early humans now carried something inside them that filled the quiet spaces between sounds. It was not fear alone anymore. It was thought, repeated thought, returning thought, the kind that does not leave easily once it enters the mind. They rested in their usual formation near the rocks and trees, but their rest was lighter, more fragmented. Their senses had become trained to notice even the smallest disturbances. The shift of grass, the crack of a distant branch, the faint movement of wind through uneven terrain. But tonight, there was no immediate danger, only stillness. And within that stillness, change continued quietly. The young man sat slightly apart as always. The stones were beside him. The burnt stick rested nearby, darker now, worn by constant handling. He did not strike the stones much tonight. Instead, he observed them under faint starlight, as if expecting them to reveal something beyond their physical form. His thinking had shifted again. It was no longer only about actions and results. It was about conditions. He remembered fire from the storm. He remembered lightning striking the ground. He remembered burnt land, smoke rising, and transformation occurring without human intervention. And now, for the first time, he began to consider relationships between events. Lightning and fire, wood and burning, stone and sound, separate things, but possibly connected, not in words, not in structured reasoning, but in growing mental associations that repeated themselves over and over again. Across the group, one member shifted in sleep, letting out a small sound. Instantly, a few eyes opened. The instinct to remain alert was still strong, even if the threat was not present. After a brief pause, they relaxed again. But this pause itself was new. They were beginning to evaluate before reacting. As the night continued, a faint wind passed through the valley. It moved gently across the ground, brushing against stones and dry leaves. The sound was soft but noticeable. The young man picked up one stone. He held it still, then struck it against the other. A clear sound broke the silence. He paused, listened, then repeated. But this time, he adjusted his grip slightly. The sound changed. He repeated again. Different angle, different result. And slowly, something began to settle in his mind more clearly than before. Control. Not full control of fire. Not full control of nature. But control of small outcomes through small changes in action. This realization was subtle, but powerful. It marked a transition from accidental discovery toward intentional manipulation. Elsewhere, one of the group members watched him quietly, then, without moving closer, picked up a stone and tried to imitate the motion from where he sat. The result was inconsistent, but similar enough to notice. Another member followed, then another. Without instruction, the behavior spread again. The sound of stone striking stone echoed softly through the night, not loud enough to disturb the land, but enough to create a shared rhythm among them. It was not coordinated, but it was collective, and that was important. As dawn approached slowly, the sky began to lighten in thin layers of gray and blue. The group stirred awake one by one. The air was cool, and the ground still held traces of night's moisture. They prepared to move again. But before leaving, something unusual happened. The young man did not immediately begin walking. Instead, he placed one stone on a flat surface of rock, then struck it once with another stone. Then he stopped and watched, as if waiting for something to respond. Nothing did, but instead of confusion, there was observation. He repeated the action again, struck, paused, watched. This pattern had never existed in their behavior before in this structured form. Action, result, observation, adjustment. It was becoming a loop, and within that loop, learning was accelerating. The group eventually began moving again, following familiar patterns of travel through uneven land. But now, their awareness was sharper. They noticed changes in terrain more quickly. They responded to distant sounds with more patience. They examined paths before committing to them. Even fear was changing. It was no longer instant. It was processed. By midday, they reached another transitional landscape where grasslands met scattered forests. The environment was richer here, with more resources, but also more unpredictability. As they moved through it, they encountered something new. A small stream cutting through dense vegetation, not wide, but active, flowing steadily between rocks and roots. Animals gathered nearby, smaller ones again, cautious but present. The group watched from a distance. This time, there was no immediate withdrawal. They observed longer, tracked movement, evaluated. The young man knelt near the edge of their position and picked up a stone. He did not throw it. He did not strike it immediately. He simply held it while watching the animals. Then he placed it down again. This delay was new. Between impulse and action, space had appeared. And in that space, thought could grow. The group eventually moved on without interaction, but something had changed again. They were now consistently balancing observation with restraint. By evening, they found shelter under a wide rock formation that naturally curved overhead, forming a protective semi-cave. It was not fully enclosed, but it provided security. They settled in. The burnt stick and stones were placed together again. But this time, no one focused on them immediately. Instead, the group simply rested, not in exhaustion alone, but in familiarity. The world was still dangerous, still unpredictable, still vast, but their understanding of it had grown slightly deeper with each passing day, and in the quiet space between stone, fire, memory, and imitation, something irreversible was unfolding. The early humans were no longer just reacting to the world. They were beginning to shape their understanding of it. The semi-cave where they rested that night felt different from the open valleys they had grown used to. It was not fully enclosed, but it gave the illusion of safety. A curved rock overhead blocked much of the wind, and the ground beneath was slightly warmer, holding the memory of the day's sun. The early humans gathered inside it instinctively, as if the land itself had offered them a place to pause. But even here, safety was never complete. The world outside continued moving. Wind shifted through the trees. Distant animal calls echoed through the valley. Occasionally, the sound of something heavy moving across rocks reached them faintly, reminding them that they were still part of a much larger system they did not control. Inside the shelter, group arranged themselves in their familiar formation. Center protected, edges alert. Yet the tension that once defined their nights had softened slightly. Not gone, but changed. Fear was no longer absolute. It had become measured. The young man sat near the edge again, but closer to the group than before. The stones were in his hands, but his movements were slower tonight, more deliberate, less repetitive. He was not striking immediately anymore. Instead, he was thinking between actions, a pause before movement, a reflection before sound. The burnt stick lay beside him, partially resting against the stone wall. It had become an object of memory more than function. No one questioned why it remained with them. It simply did. Above them, the night sky was partially visible through the open side of the shelter. Stars appeared one by one, distant and unchanged, but the way they were perceived was shifting slowly within the group. Some now stared longer at the sky, not out of fear, but out of quiet curiosity. Patterns were beginning to emerge in their awareness, not just on the ground, but above it. Time passed slowly. At one point, a faint sound came from outside the shelter. A rustle, then silence, then movement again. The group tensed, but did not fully panic. They waited. The sound did not approach. After a long pause, it faded into the distance. And just like that, their reaction cycle completed differently than before. No rush, no scattering, only evaluation. This small change would have been impossible for them to recognize consciously, but it was shaping their behavior deeply. Inside the young man's mind, something else was forming again. He looked at the stones, then at the burnt stick, then at the ground. He lifted one stone, but instead of striking it, he placed it against another stone and simply pressed. No sound. Then he changed angle, pressed again. Still nothing. He paused. This pause lasted longer than usual, and in that silence, his mind revisited earlier memories. Lightning in the storm, fire spreading across dry grass, burning valley, smoke rising, stone impacts. He was not just recalling events now. He was comparing them, not consciously structured, but emotionally and visually linked. And in that linkage, a fragile idea formed. Some things require a trigger. Some things require conditions. Fire does not come from nothing. It comes from something happening first. This idea was incomplete, but it was powerful enough to remain. Elsewhere in the shelter, another member watched him for a moment, then slowly picked up a stone and attempted the same pressing motion. Another followed shortly after. The imitation continued, but with even less urgency than before. It was becoming a shared background activity rather than a novelty. And that, too, was important. Because when imitation becomes natural, learning becomes constant. As the night deepened further, most of the group drifted into sleep. The shelter held them loosely, protecting from wind, but not from the vastness of the world outside. The young man remained awake a little longer. He held both stones again. This time, he did not strike them. He simply looked outward through the opening of the shelter, beyond the valley, beyond the hills, beyond what they had already seen. And in his mind, something new appeared, not a memory, not a reaction, but a projection, a possibility. What if fire could be created again? Not by lightning, not by accident, but by action. This thought was fragile, unstable, not yet shaped into method or understanding, but it existed. And existence of such a thought marked another step forward, because for the first time, early humans were beginning to imagine outcomes that had not yet happened. The world was no longer only what was seen. It was what could be made to happen. As dawn slowly approached beyond the horizon, the shelter remained quiet. The group slept. The wind softened. The land waited. Dawn arrived slowly, as if the world itself was reluctant to break the silence of night. The first light slipped through the opening of the semi-cave, touching the sleeping forms of the early humans with a soft, pale glow. The wind outside had calmed during the night, leaving the valley unusually still. Even the distant animal calls were quieter, as though the land was holding its breath. Inside the shelter, the group began to stir one by one. Slow movements, heavy eyelids, quiet awareness returning. The night had passed without major danger, and that alone was becoming something they could recognize as a pattern. Survival was no longer just luck. It was becoming expectation shaped by experience. The young man was already awake. He had not slept deeply. His mind had remained active through the night, circling around the same idea again and again. Fire, stone, lightning, impact, heat. Not in clear language, but in repeating images that refused to separate from each other. He sat near the opening of the shelter, looking out at the valley as it slowly brightened. The stones were in his hands again, but something had changed in how he held them. Less curiosity, more focus, as if he was not just observing them anymore, but testing them. Behind him, the group began preparing to move. There was no formal decision-making, no spoken agreement. Movement simply resumed when the environment felt right. That was their way of understanding time. But before they left, something subtle drew attention again. The young man struck the stones. Once, a clean sound echoed softly into the morning air. Then he paused, longer than before, then struck again, but differently this time. The angle had changed. The force had changed. The sound changed. A few members of the group turned their heads. They were no longer surprised by the action itself, but they were beginning to notice variation. And variation meant learning. One of them stepped closer, picked up a stone, and tried to replicate the movement more carefully than before. Another followed, watching closely first, then imitating. This was no longer scattered imitation. It was becoming structured attention. The young man watched them briefly, then stood. He picked up both stones and began walking. The group followed. The land ahead was rising again. Gentle hills stretched forward, covered in patches of grass and scattered trees. The terrain was not as harsh as before, but it was not predictable either. It demanded constant awareness. As they moved, something unusual happened. They came across a place where the ground was blackened again, not as large as before, not as intense, but still unmistakable. Burnt soil, broken branches, ash scattered unevenly across a small clearing. The group stopped immediately. Memory returned instantly. Fire. The atmosphere shifted. Even though no flames were present, the presence of what fire had done was enough to change their behavior. Some stepped back slightly. Others leaned forward cautiously. The young man moved closer. He knelt and touched the blackened ground. It was cold. This was not recent fire, but it was real evidence of transformation. He looked at the burnt remains carefully, then at the surrounding area, then at the sky. No storm was present now. No lightning, no obvious cause, and yet fire had been here. The question that had been forming in him became sharper. Not just where fire comes from, but whether it can be made to happen again. He picked up a small, burnt stick fragment from the ground, turned it in his hand. It crumbled slightly. The group slowly gathered around him, observing but not interfering. They were learning to watch before reacting. The young man then picked up a stone and placed it near the burnt fragment. He did not strike. He did not test immediately. He simply placed them together, then paused. This pause was different again. It was not hesitation. It was expectation, as if the arrangement itself might produce something. Nothing happened, but his mind did not reject that outcome. Instead, it stored it and adjusted. This was the beginning of experimentation without instruction. The group eventually moved away from the burnt clearing, but the image stayed with them longer than usual, even as they walked through greener areas and open land again. Their attention occasionally drifted back to the idea of fire and what it leaves behind. By midday, they reached a region where the land became richer again. More vegetation, more water sources, more signs of animal life. They slowed their pace, observing carefully, and then they saw something that made them stop again. A small group of animals gathered near a muddy water hole. Not large predators, not dangerous in appearance, but alert, constantly shifting, always watching. The humans observed from a distance. This time, there was no immediate urge to retreat. There was evaluation, distance, cover, opportunity, risk. These invisible calculations were becoming more frequent in their behavior, even without words. The young man did not move forward, but he watched longer than before. Then he looked at the stones in his hand. And for a brief moment, something new appeared in his thinking. Not action, not reaction, but planning. The group eventually moved on without interaction, but the moment remained significant. They were beginning to see the world not just as events happening around them, but as systems that could be understood over time. As evening approached, they found a suitable resting area near a cluster of rocks overlooking the valley. It offered height, visibility, and partial protection. They settled in. The burnt stick was placed near the young man again. But this time, it was no longer just an object of curiosity. It was becoming part of a pattern of thought. As night began to fall once more, the group prepared for rest. The sky darkened. Stars appeared gradually. The wind softened. And inside one mind, the idea that had been forming for many days finally became clearer. Not complete, not yet fully shaped, but undeniable in its direction. Fire might not be random. It might be caused, and if it can be caused, it might be recreated. As the group drifted into sleep, the world remained vast and unchanged. But humanity was no longer only observing it. It was beginning to question how it works. The night settled over the valley like a final, quiet breath. The early humans rested near the rocks on higher ground, their bodies tired from travel, but their minds no longer as empty as they once were. The sky above them stretched wide and endless, filled with the same stars their ancestors had once looked at without understanding. But now, something was different in the way they existed beneath it. They were no longer only reacting to the world. They were beginning to interpret it. The group slept in scattered rhythms, some deeply, some lightly, some waking briefly at distant sounds before returning to rest. The familiar cycle of fear had not disappeared, but it had softened into something more manageable, something less absolute. And in the center of this fragile calm, the young man remained half awake longer than the rest. The stones were still with him. The burnt stick lay beside him, but his attention was no longer scattered between objects. It was focused inward. He replayed everything. Fire from the storm, burnt land in the valley, stone striking stone, imitation from others, patterns repeating across days and landscapes. Each memory no longer stood alone. They were connected now by invisible threads inside his mind. Threads he could not name, but could feel. He lifted one stone slowly, then the other, and instead of striking immediately, he paused for a long time, not out of hesitation, but out of expectation, as if the world might respond differently this time. The silence stretched. The valley was still. Even the wind seemed distant. Then he struck. A clean sound broke the night air, and in that instant, nothing changed outside, but everything changed inside him, because the action was no longer random. It was intentional. He struck again, softer, then harder, a different angle. Each variation produced a different sound, and each sound confirmed something important. Action could be controlled. Effects could be predicted. Change could be explored. This was no longer instinct. This was the beginning of understanding. Around him, one of the group members stirred and opened his eyes. He watched silently from a short distance, then slowly picked up his own stone and tried to copy the movement. Another followed, then another. The pattern returned, but this time it was stronger, more stable, more deliberate. Not imitation for curiosity alone, but imitation for learning. And learning, once shared, becomes the foundation of something far greater than survival. As dawn approached again, the sky began to lighten slowly. The stars faded one by one. The valley below them came into view, revealing a world that looked unchanged, but was no longer perceived the same way. The group began to prepare for movement, but before they left, something important happened for the last time in this journey. The young man stood at the edge of the rocks and looked outward. The land stretched endlessly ahead, hills, valleys, rivers, unknown paths. He held the stones in one hand, the burnt stick in the other. He did not strike. He did not experiment. He simply observed. And in that observation, something final began to settle inside him. The world was not only something to survive in, it was something to understand. And perhaps, one day, something to shape. The group moved forward again, disappearing into the vast landscape. Behind them, the rocks, the valley, the burnt earth, and the silent traces of fire remained unchanged. But humanity had changed in a way that could not be reversed. They now carried memory, imitation, observation, curiosity, and the earliest form of controlled thought, the beginning of tools, the beginning of fire, the beginning of understanding cause and effect.